Welcome to part 3 of my tutorial video series, which today deals with syntax, or in other words, what makes up our sentences. So today we go from complicated to easy, at least I hope so. And here you can see one of the most complicated sentences we can analyze with the tools you get in your class, at least without repeating ourselves too much. And I tried to incorporate as much as I possibly could into that one sentence, which reads, if we had noticed the complex problems with our modern world acceptably earlier for a reaction, we would have elected you, our spokesperson, as it would have been only natural for us that we would have given you the job. So first, let's look at form. On a formal level, we have clauses and phrases. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, how many clauses do we find in this sentence? And we can see 4. A quick reminder, a clause is just a unit of a sentence that contains a subject and a verb, and that is a kind of individual sentence, but it cannot always stand on its own. So if we have a subordinate clause, that has to come with a main clause. And in this case, the main clause that could stand all alone would be, we would have elected you, our spokesperson. We could say that all on its own. And the other 3 clauses, the yellow one, if we had noticed the complex problems for a reaction, and as it would have been only natural for us, and in red, that we would have given you the job, all those are subordinate clauses which cannot stand on their own. So we've got really a complex sentence here with 4 clauses. Now, the next step would be, what phrases do we find? And we will not stay with this slide for too long because I broke down the phrases in the upcoming slides. And in this case, you can just see all the phrases color-coded, blue for noun phrases, red for verb phrases, green for adverb phrases, and violet for adjective phrases. And do we have anything else? Have I missed anything? If I did, it will come up. So first we've got the noun phrase. It's, I think, the most common phrase that, at least in my experience, occurs in the English language. And the noun phrase has 4 parts. Let's start with the head, because it's the obligatory part that has to be there for the phrase to be a noun phrase. And the head is a noun or pronoun, can be both. For the example I picked, the complex problems with our modern world, we have a noun as the head, namely problems. The head is further modified by the pre-modifier, which in this case is complex, an adjective. And the head is also further modified by the post modifier with our modern world, which is a prepositional phrase. We get to that later. And post modifiers can be kind of tricky sometimes because you have prepositional phrases all on their own, for example, as adverbials in your sentence, or the post modifier can also be an entire clause. So how do you know whether the post modifier belongs to the noun phrase or whether it's an independent adverbial? Let me tell you the story of an example we had in my introductory class. Farmer attacks cow with an axe. It was a newspaper headline. Obviously, it's not an entirely complete sentence. But the important thing is that cow and with an axe was our question. Does it belong together or doesn't it? So part of our class said that with an axe is the post modifier of cow. And other parts said it's an adverbial. And now for this question, you always have to picture, does it make sense? So if the cow had with an axe as its post modifier, it would mean that the cow had been holding the axe. which obviously doesn't make sense. So in this case, we have an adverbial together with the noun with the noun phrase. So it's not part of the noun phrase. But when we look at the problems with our modern world, the problems clearly have to do with the modern world. If there wasn't the modern world, we wouldn't have problems in this example. So that's a post modifier. And after that rather lengthy explanation, we still have the determinative left. The determinative basically makes a noun phrase either determined or not. So the determinative usually is an article or determiner, as we say here in linguistics. In this case, it's the, but we will see examples in the same sentence where it can also be a pronoun like our or my, which also becomes the determiner. If it's, let's say, in a construction like my problems, my would also be a determiner. Next up, we've got the verb phrase. In my opinion, the easiest phrase there is, because A, it has only two parts, and B, it can fulfill exactly one function in the sentence, namely the verb. And what is a verb phrase? We have the obligatory main verb, which in my example is noticed, a full verb, word class wise, and the auxiliary verb, which doesn't have to be there, but in our example we have one, is had. So all the auxiliary verb does is modify the aspect or the tense of the main verb. And in this case, it puts the whole construction into the past. Had, noticed. And as we already have a primary verb here, we can already look at primary verbs because they are peculiar. They are the only verbs that can fill both positions of auxiliary verb and main verb. So full verbs can never be auxiliary verbs. And on the other hand, modals like would, will, can, they cannot be full verbs. That's a rule that's always like that. So only be, do, and have as the primary verbs can be either auxiliary verb or a main verb. Then we've got the adjective phrase. In the adjective phrase, we've got a similar structure to the noun phrase, just without the determiner or determinative. And we again have a head, which is the obligatory part, and always an adjective. And in that example, it's natural. So the example altogether would be only natural for us. Again, we've got a post modifier, which arguably is a little more debatable than the example before. I put it in as a post modifier for us as a prepositional phrase. But I think in this case, you potentially could make a case. But for me, it's rather a post modifier. And pre-modifier is the same thing as in a noun phrase. It also further modifies the head, just like the post modifier. And our pre-modifier here is an adverb only. Then we've got the adverb phrase. And in the adverb phrase, we've got the exact same structure as in the adjective phrase, just with the one addition that the head must be an adverb, obviously, because we've got an adverb phrase, the head is an adverb, like early here. And the pre-modifier, again, further modifies the head and is also an adverb in this case. So for most of these pre and post modifiers, you've got several options. I'm trying to show you as many as I can, but ultimately that is down to context as well. But for the adjective and adverb phrase, an adverb as the pre-modifier is a very likely option that you have. And prepositional phrases are also often post modifiers, as here, for a reaction, or you can also have clauses as post modifiers very often. Rarely, particularly in the noun phrase, you can have another noun phrase as a pre-modifier for your noun phrase, but that's rare. And as I said, it's a bit down to context and comes with practice. unfortunately, syntax has to be practiced. Last but not least, we've got the prepositional phrase with an entirely different structure from the noun, adverb, and adjective phrase. And another thing which is new is that both components are obligatory. So we need both the preposition and the prepositional complement. So for the preposition, it's kind of obvious it's a preposition. It always is a preposition word class wise. There is no other way. So in our example, for a reaction, which is, as you might have noticed, one of the post modifiers of a previous example, we've got for as our preposition. And the prepositional complement is everything that comes after the preposition and belongs to it. In most cases, a noun phrase. It can also be a clause, and it can be several other things, in fact. But in my experience, the most usual case is a noun phrase. Here we have a reaction. And don't worry about the details of the analysis. You will have a full analysis of the sentence at the end of the video, which, particularly to those who are in the tutorial with me, you will find it on Moodle. So that was the form. Now we get to the function. So while the form is more about how do we formulate our sentence word class wise and phrase wise, we now get to the constituents. This is getting very colorful now, and I think this is a good point of talking about how do you find what belongs together or what is a constituent. And while there are several ways of doing it, two have been the most suitable for me. One is if we switch around the order of the sentence. What do we leave together? The things we leave together when we switch it around are the things that belong together. Or, for example, if we can delete something. If we can delete part of a sentence that is actually a dead giveaway that it's an adverbial when the sentence still works after you've deleted something, and that something, yeah, is an adverbial then, mostly, or actually always. And a third way of doing that would be if you replaced, for example, in our sentence, our spokesperson with it, and everything you comprise in that one pronoun also belongs together. Again, that's a bit down to personal taste. What works best for you? Those three ways are, I think, the most common ones. There might be one or two others, but that's really down to how you understand best what belongs together. So let's get into it. We've got the subject, which is abbreviated by S, and these abbreviations are really, really important also for the phrases, because when you write an analysis, you don't want to always write the full thing. In fact, once the sentences get complicated, you don't have the space to do that. So really learn these abbreviations. Don't use other abbreviations unless your teacher tells you so, of course. It's always a precaution here. But usually there is one abbreviation of how to do this, and that's how it works. So the subject. We also have this in German. We have basically in every other language. I wouldn't know a single one, at least in Europe, that doesn't have a subject. So the subject is who or what does it in a sentence. And I picked a very simple noun phrase from our sentence, namely a simple we. We as a pronoun is the head of the noun phrase that is the subject. So here you can already see how an analysis would look. We write the function at the beginning as the S for subject. Then we write that it's a noun phrase signified by NP. And then we look at the part of the noun phrase, which in this case is the head. And the head is word class wise a pronoun, and that is we. So far, so simple. Now let's get to the verb. The verb is also something that is very common, that is actually easy to understand, and it just says what happens in the sentence. So we've got the, which signifies the verb, and the function verb. Then we've got the form verb phrase, VP. And in this case, we have a rather complicated verb phrase with several auxiliary verbs, which is possible, but you can only have one main verb. So we have would, the modal, as an auxiliary verb. We have as a primary verb in an auxiliary function. And then we've got elected as our main verb, which is a full verb. The direct object is who or what is manipulated in this sentence. It's already a little harder to put in words than the subject or the verb. And basically, there is one important rule of thumb. If you only have one object in your sentence, it always has to be a direct object. We get to the indirect object later, and the indirect object can never, ever, ever, ever stand alone. So we've got the direct object here. And for this one, I picked a rather complex example. If you want to get more context, you can always scroll back to the sentence or rewind to the sentence. In this case, it comes from if we had understood the complex problems or something like that. Anyway, it's not really manipulated, but it's definitely not who or what does something, but it's rather what is something that something is done to. So in this case, what is understood. And here we've got a complex noun phrase, as I said, with all 4 parts that are there. And as I've already talked about this earlier, I'll go through it rather quickly. So we've got OD. The D usually goes below the O, but in lowercase, but that's unfortunately in my version of PowerPoint not possible, or if it's possible, I didn't find it. So we've got the direct object, which is a noun phrase, with the determinative, which is a determiner, the. Then we've got the pre-modifier, which is an adjective, complex. We've got the head, which is a noun, problems, and we've got the post-modifier, which is a prepositional phrase with our modern world. If we did a full analysis now, we would take that apart as well. But for the time being, we just put the whole prepositional phrase. You will see in the last slide how it looks when it's done completely. Now, the aforementioned indirect object is who or what benefits or suffers from what is done in the sentence. And as I said, it can't ever stand on its own. It always comes with a direct object. So you have to have it, and you have to have 2 objects in your sentence to be able to have an indirect object, which comes before the direct object. So here I picked a very simple indirect object, and usually most of them, most of those I've seen so far are that simple. It's a simple you, which is a noun phrase with the head, the head is the pronoun you. So those were the objects. Let's get to something that is, in my experience, the least well-known of all these constituents, the complements. We have 2 of them, and we're starting with the subject complement. And the subject complement can be paraphrased with what does the subject equal. So you can link this to the subject by equals. Whenever you can do that, then you usually have a subject complement. And very often they are linked to the subject by a copula, so by to be, or by similar verbs, which you can always replace by equals, so that it makes sense, of course. So here I picked a medium complex, well, actually it's pretty complex for an adjective phrase example, and adjective phrases are actually very common subject complements or also object complements. And here we've got only natural for us as described before. So we've got the pre-modifier, the adverb only, then we've got the head, the adjective natural, and we've got the post modifier, the prepositional phrase for us, which again in a full analysis would be taken apart as well. And again, the S of the CS would be in lowercase. And we've also got the object complement, which is basically the same as a subject complement, but it goes with the direct object. It can again be linked to the direct object this time by equals, and normally stands directly behind that object that it belongs to. Here we've got the example of the noun phrase our spokesperson, from the part of the sentence where it says, we would have elected you our spokesperson, where you would be the object and the direct object, and our spokesperson is the object complement. And actually elect is the prime example of a verb that often has object complements. So what do we have? We have the CO, again the O goes in lowercase with the noun phrase and P, with the determinative, DTM, which is a determiner, DET, our. Now here we have that pronoun case that I talked about before. And we have the head with a noun, or which is a noun, which is normal for a noun phrase, and that is the spokesperson. Last but not least, we've got the adverbial. An adverbial basically is any additional information we are given about the sentence, about the time, about the place, about the reason, about how something is done. And if you can delete something, that's what I meant before, in a sentence, and the sentence still works grammatically, then you most likely have an adverbial. So for this adverbial, I've got the adverb phrase, acceptably early for a reaction, which gives us additional information about the time. And here we've got an adverb phrase with the pre-modifier, the adverb acceptably. Then we've got a head, which is also an adverb, early, and the post modifier, which is a prepositional phrase for a reaction. So let's get down to the crunch, the things that you will have to do in your exam, namely a syntactic analysis. How do we do this? How do we go about all that we've covered so far? So let's go through it step by step. First, we have to determine the clause boundaries. So you can see this by conjunctions, because conjunctions usually or always link several clauses. Tiny hint here, you've got coordinative and subordinative conjunctions. And the coordinative conjunctions, which coordinate two main clauses, can be best remembered by an acronym which goes like this. You've got fanboys, so simply the word fanboys, where F stands for, A stands for and, N stands for nor, B stands for but, O stands for or, Y stands for yet, and S stands for so. Those are the most common coordinative conjunctions and easily remembered by that one word. So if you've got a coordinative clause, you've got two, or a coordinative conjunction, you've got two main clauses. For other conjunctions, you usually have a subordinate clause, which can have a different subject than the main clause, other than when you link two main clauses where the subject has to be the same. For most of your analysis, you will meet subordinate clauses simply because they're more common, I guess, and in my opinion, also easier to analyze. So when we've got the clauses, we should also look for the main clause in that step, and then find and name the constituents with the function. And the function also goes for clauses here. Clauses, when they are subordinate, have a function in the main clause. So they can either be adverbials, like an if clause, that would be an adverbial. But we'll see all that in the full analysis. I think then it makes more sense. And in the third step, when we've got the constituents, so subject, verb, object, what kind of object, and so on, we go on to name the phrases. So the subject, what is it? Is it a clause? Is it a noun phrase? And the adverbial, is it a prepositional phrase? Is it an adverbial phrase? That's the question we have to ask ourselves then. And the simplest question of all those is, what phrase is the verb? A verb phrase. And last, we have to determine the word class. And we have to write all that down to get to an analysis. And before we get to the full analysis, here are some helpful hints that I've found students need in the last couple of semesters. So first one is, you can't have a complete clause without a subject and a verb. Both have to be there. I mean, the simplest sentence you can have is something like, I exist, where you have I as the subject and exist as the verb. You can't ever, as I said before, have an indirect object without a direct object. So once you have two objects, one of them is indirect and the other is direct. You only have one object. You don't ever have to think about it in an indirect object because it has to be a direct object. Then heads of adjective and adverb phrases are always adjectives in the adjective phrase and adverbs in the adverb phrase, and never the other way around. I've seen that mixed up at least 10 times. And very importantly, if you want to practice syntax, don't just dig out a newspaper and take the first sentence you find, because what we're doing here is rather basic. There is so much more to syntax. And if you take just any sentence, you will most likely run into something you cannot answer with what we're doing here. So this is the full analysis of the sentence I put together. And you can already see that the structure is important. So just for the sake of remembering what you did and for having a better overview of your sentence and being able to correct mistakes more easily if you have to, please put the stuff together correctly. It's really important to have the head underneath the pre-modifier and the determinative, to have the functions of the same level above each other, and so on and so forth. And you can see that space is an issue. So you always want to start on the very right of your page and put down your words on the right and start on the very left with the first function you have. Because once things get complicated, and whenever there is a prepositional phrase, they do, you will need every little inch you can find on your sheet of paper. And other than that, I can only say I encourage you to pause the video as long as you want to look at the sentence. For the students in my tutorial, you also find this analysis as a PDF on the Moodle. And with that, I come to the end of syntax, and I'm looking forward to practicing syntax with you. And that is also the end of my video. See you next week.